themselves, and we'll do another round of briefer introductions of ourselves next time. Steaming up my glasses. I don't know about you, I have this sense of doom for Monday, like, the U.S. inauguration.
Oh.
I've been in this little bubble of, I'm not sure what's coming and there's nothing I can do about it, so I'm just gonna, float along in oblivion. And, as of on my way in this morning, I'm starting to get the text messages from reporters saying, can you talk about what Donald Trump will mean for climate change? And, okay. Okay, I'm gonna have to, so much from my little bubble, it is about to burst, and there will be folks saying, much more upbeat things about how the cost of renewables has gone down so much that it's all going to happen anyway. And some of that's true, but it's not really mine. I'm not that hopeful. I think he's really, really bad for the planet. Alrighty. Okay, so. I have allergies. I'm allergic to everything. And so I will just be sneezing and snuffling all the time. Generally I go with, am I sneezing and snuffling and feeling rotten, or just sneezing and snuffling and feeling normal? So if I'm feeling rotten, I won't come to class. Okay, so the readings for today are about the economic history of Canada. We will be focusing on fossil fuels for most of the course, but this is setting things up and talking about how fossil fuels were preceded by export of a whole lot of other natural resources from the 1600s on. We are looking at that through the lens of Staples theory, obviously, which is a theory that emerged in the late 20s, the 1930s. Canadian, economic historians. I don't think the disciplines were not so divided back then. In fact, the political science and economics departments at UBC, I think, were one department until about the 70s, or maybe into the 70s. So, Canadian scholars, it was revisited in the 1960s. In a period of Canadian nationalism, but with a different twist, looking to the U.S. as the dominant hegemon rather than the UK, and then has a lot of folks have returned to that in the last 10-15 years with attention to fossil fuels. And we've got some of that history built into the readings, a summary of Innes's arguments. I didn't assign Innes's actual words because after reading everybody else's accounts of Innes, like a year and a half ago, preparing for this course, I actually sat down and read some of Innes's stuff. I'm like, oh man, students are gonna hate this. So, has anyone read Innes's original work? Matthew Evan did, who is an economic geographer and historian, in something he's written said, Harold Innes often quoted, seldom read, because it's just really hard going. So instead I've given you other folks' summaries of Innes's arguments, then some discussion, through Gunton's chapter of the rejuvenation of Staples theory in the 1960s, in sort of a Canadian political economy tradition that emerged during that period. The introduction by Arthur Ray from the late 1990s, which is drawing on historians' rethinking of Innes's work, and then Gunton's chapter, which I think was written about 2015, I can't remember the exact year. Because it's a history, it's an economic history in a sense of Canada, but it's also a history of academic literature about Canada that has changed over time. And I want to take a step back just for a few minutes, and all of these novel ideas that are coming from scholars come from human beings who are products of their time. So I'm going to give you a little personal history about some of these folks. Harold Innes is the scholar most associated that originated Staples theory, although he was joined by colleagues at U of T, W.A. McIntosh, who wrote about wheat, Donald Creighton, who wrote about the St. Lawrence, Innes himself, cod fishery, fur trade. Innes's wife, Mary Quayle Innes, was his former student and also an intellectual partner. She was a gold medalist in her graduating class. She typed his PhD thesis, edited his works after his death, and was really sort of a defender of his reputation after his death. But like so many women of that generation, was basically invisible behind the great man. And even, she, as far as I can tell, she never had a faculty appointment. I'm not sure she ever got paid for the work that she did advancing his career. And even into, well, definitely when I was first got a faculty appointment, there was, UBC was littered with sort of the brilliant wives of the tenured male faculty members who were, who had never had a tenured position. And to some degree, there's still some of that going on. Innes himself had been a soldier in World War I. I don't know the details of his service. Ray talks about him. It sounds like he had injuries and also mental health challenges after he returned from the war. And his canoe trip across Canada after the war was both sort of restorative for him personally, but also part of his research for his work on fur trade in Canada, which was his first book on it. But it also, undoubtedly, as academics who never talk that much about this, it was made possible for this man to go off for months canoeing across Canada because his wife was home raising many children that they had. One of those children, and Innes Stagg, I got to know first because she married my former thesis supervisor, so there's like a little personal tie-in there. And she's a she just died last year, a wildlife biologist and feminist scholar whose own personal history kind of sadly mirrored her mom's in many ways. Sad in the sense, I hope she had a fulfilling career. She did lots of stuff, but sad in the sense that she didn't get the recognition that she could have. She was an innovative wildlife biologist, did the first studies of giraffes in the wild that have actually been kind of rejuvenated by biologists in recent years, even though this is work that she did back in the 1960s, I think. She was denied tenure at the University of Guelph because her family lived in Waterloo, where her husband was a professor, and she wasn't present all the time in the department, and that was considered a disadvantage, and she was denied a tenured position, and I don't think ever got one. I think she had various contract appointments and visiting scholar gigs, primarily at the University of Waterloo, well into her 70s. And she was a feminist scholar. She did work on women in academia, women in science, and also interesting research on how our humans' gendered experience of the world has warped our studies of animals, and how we have, anthropomorphized animals based on our own gendered culture. Okay, I'll leave it at that. But when I was researching Innes, I was like, if you go into history, there's always a little more history there. Okay, the Staples thesis. What is it? You've read about it, there's a lot going on, so I'm not expecting anybody to get it all. But what are some of the parts of the Staples thesis? Let's see. Yeah, Victoria.
Essentially like an export-based economy based on natural resources.
So exporting natural resources to whom and who?
Like outside the country?
To
Outside, but specifically, yeah, Kelly.
advanced nations.
Advanced nations, and in the case of colonies like Canada, it was we're the satellite to the home nation, so it would have been France and England originally. So natural resources. Why? Why exporting raw natural resources? Tim.
Because that's what those countries, France and the UK, needed, and so and also because there was a lack of the local market, especially with fur, and even with like wheat and oil, like we can't consume all of it, so it has to go somewhere else, and we have to become continuously reliant on that.
We're going to come back to oil.
Okay.
But for now, like looking at the sort of early, first 100 years, 150 years, pre-Confederation, that's what the UK wanted. They already cut down all their trees. So there's this huge land with abundant natural resources and not very many people to demand that. Lots of the people were over here in France and England, the resources over here, so the colonial settlers harvested those resources, sent them back, and what did they get in return? Yeah, Sean.
Could I add something before
You bet.
answering?
Please do.
I was just going to add that the processing was taking place in the metropole, so we're sending the raw goods, but then they're being turned into commodities for sale, which the demand is in the metropole and not in the colony.
Metropole. Thank you.
Yeah.
I couldn't think of the word.
Yeah. In exchange for rights, land, and money. I'm thinking about like the Hudson Bay Company.
And other stuff that the settlers needed, like teapots and, knives and forks and clothing, gunpowder, guns. So the manufactured stuff was coming back, the raw materials, unprocessed, were heading in that direction. They probably salted the cod or did something to preserve it, logs, pelts of animals, and so on. That was the comparative advantage of what is now Canada from the perspective of settlers and from the perspective of England and France. Like, there's all this stuff, we want that. For whatever reason, the settlers wanted out of France and England. They wanted more space, they wanted more opportunities. So this was, that was the deal that worked for them. What else? What else is part of? Yeah.
There was some, I don't like economics, but there was some economic language about how the staple economy remains quite underdeveloped in a lot of ways. It doesn't have a manufacturing capacity, and things like, one example that Belshaw, one of them uses is the grain elevators, that a grain elevator can't be repurposed in the same way that a factory that makes widget A can be repurposed to make widget B. And in the case of grain, that's fine because we're always going to need to make bread, but in the case of something like oil or furs, when an economy and a society is geared so heavily towards this one staple, there's great risk that comes with it, even though there's a lot of richness as well that is derived.
So the Staples trap, which has there's different aspects to the Staples trap, but one of them is this idea that once you have developed your economy to ship out unprocessed natural resources, it's going to deter further economic development. Now, in the case of wheat, there was some, and that's one of the reasons that Macintosh was a little more hopeful. They had to build railways to get the wheat, and that was something that was left for other uses. But if you are shipping out the beaver pelts, you're not in the hat manufacturing business. So you're not developing the factories that make that stuff. We were not processing lumber, and we were sending presumably just the logs. I don't know whether there were lumber mills that were, chopping them up a bit. That's pretty basic industry, but that this economy built on exporting unprocessed natural resources became self-sustaining and deterred development. So the argument goes of industry. You said you don't like economics. You said it's kind of in passing. How come?
Oh, I took Econ 101 and then this was hard. But no, I actually, the not the nitty gritty part, the math part, yeah, I can miss, but the actual idea of, managing scarcity and resource, all this, that part of economics does quite appeal to me. And the idea that, okay, there are these pelts and there is this demand there and there is a literal ecosystem. There's also an ecosystem that pops up of traders and sellers and hunters and trappers and all these things that happen. That's economics too. That's pretty interesting.
Okay. It was an opportunity for me to probe on that because I do think, I think back to how I thought about economics when I was a student, especially a graduate student. And I think there's kind of a lot going on with any discipline. One of them is economics as a way as a sort of set of methods and theories to try understand the world. And the other is economics as a normative, and therefore this is what we should do. Economic efficiency should rule. And I think those are separable things. And I think my own take is that those economic tools of analysis actually can give us a lot of insight into why. And in many ways, Innes was an economist. He was looking at how these an international political economist was basically, we think of him, more of as a historian now, but in that day, that was a very novel insight. Okay, so we've got the Staples trap, which was then picked up by the new Canadian political economy scholars of the 1960s. And that was a period of growth in Canadian universities and growth in Canadian nationalism, a pushback on academics all doing their PhDs in the US and in the UK, which had previously been the case. Look, we've got these universities, let's train our own. But Canada got a flag, its own flag for the first time in, I guess that would have been 1964. The centennial was coming up. So there was a real surge in nationalism and a pushback against the growing influence and domination of the US over Canada. So that new Canadian political economy was in many ways looking at the insights from Innes and then transferring them, instead of Canada's relationship with France and England, to the new relationship with the US, but making similar arguments about the Staples trap, that because Canada is exporting raw materials to the US, a larger market, more people, that we were still not doing the processing and industrialization. We were still exporting the raw materials rather than doing the manufacturing. So the argument went. Mercantilist comes up. I think in the Belshaw reading, I can't remember how much Ray talks about. What does that mean? That one's a little harder to pull out of the reading. Did anyone catch? I don't think
it didn't really delve into it too deeply in the readings, but my very vague understanding of mercantilism is basically a state-led or state-push economic strategy. So France or Great Britain would have a mercantilist strategy to push its influence into the new territories and also to extract economic benefit from it in a way that it wasn't simply the impulse of individual traders. There's an overarching strategy, perhaps.
I think so. I think that's a big part of it. There's also something about the capital costs. Did anyone catch the capital intensity of these of extracting these resources, Sean?
I only have a short note on it. I just have that the merchants fund the ships, and so you send the ships to harvest the goods and then ship them back. And so with that, there's like a high investment in the initial, but then it gets shipped back to pay it off.
Yeah.
But I don't have anything else.
Yeah, it's kind of, that's probably about all that's in the readings. And it was one that when I was rereading this stuff, a year and a half ago, struck me because nowadays, if we think about industries that have a high capital investment up front, they're like building big stuff. But these sectors, ships were really expensive. Building ships and also putting forward the money to provision these settlers to go forth into the wilds of what is now Canada and collect beaver pelts was a really high cost operation. They had to provide all these provisions. They sent all the industrial products for trading with First Nations. So it was a high cost operation up front, which the settlers were not able to manage. So very much controlled, and that also in the way that some sectors are natural monopolies because there's a big upfront cost, and once you've made that investment, it's hard for anyone else to compete with you. That kind of locked in a system of trading is, I believe, the argument there. But it's a bit, it sounds a bit funny from our modern era, because the idea of chips and pots and pans and guns, but like kind of small quantities of guns, being a really high capital intensive enterprise is kind of quaint, but it was at the time, and your average person could not afford to build a ship. Well, none of us could now either. How are the characteristics of the resource relevant? That's kind of subtle in the readings too, but it is a really critical insight of Innes's. I'm going to come back to Adam if no one else wants to take a shot at this. Christine, what do you think?
In terms of I was just literally reading this quote. It said it had produced a particular pattern of residence and social interaction, just because because it's, I guess, a plant has a life cycle, and you can't tend to it 24/7 like you can, I guess, lumber, where you can just find any tree. Can
you read the quote again? Just I had difficulty hearing it.
Sorry.
It's my ears, not.
It has a spatial component. As we've seen, produce a particular pattern of residence and social interaction. It also has an annual life cycle. Just thought it was kind of interesting, just thinking about indigenous ecology stuff and just how they treated nature and the way that plants do have a cycle and you have to take care of it.
Okay, no, that is actually a great quote, thank you. So let's consider the beaver. And I'm so glad that you just arrived, Avida.
Hi.
Did you read the beaver?
Yes, I did. Now I know a lot about beavers.
All right, this is perfect timing. Avida is a graduate student sitting in on this class, but also because graduate students take fewer courses, she's doing extra reading and will do a longer project than you do. But it means that unfortunately, I'm going to put you on the spot right away. the question I just posed to the class as you were coming in is how did the characteristics of each resource shape the economy that emerged for that resource? And what did you learn about the beaver?
Sure. So I think the way that he describes the beaver is almost like you would think, oh, it's just an animal, and you know, like oftentimes when we look at like scientists who explain animals, it's kind of very like sciencey. But the way he's doing it is really economic, I would say. He's describing like even like the tendency of the beaver, for example, building dams. How does that relate to hunting? How does that change the way that people can hunt beaver? And then he describes like everything. Even at one point he was like, and the tail is a delicacy. And I was like, oh, okay, great. So I think it's just a really interesting way that every single part of the beaver and every single aspect of it is described in an economic and resourceful sort of way. Yeah.
So it's like the characteristics of the beaver and how they're useful and to whom.
Yeah.
You really love that little beaver. Didn't you get a sense that
Yeah.
he's like, consider the beaver?
I think he definitely thought it was a very cool animal, which, I mean, I think he was probably like fascinated by it, and I think that kind of also ties back to like the European, like this is like a new sort of being, and it's like this new fascination almost. And he also describes the way that indigenous people hunted the beaver traditionally, and then how that changes with like European settlers, and I thought that was interesting as well.
Thank you. Ben?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, the characteristics of beaver also kind of shaped their trade because of when their fur was thick. Because in the summer their fur is the thinnest, and so that was when it was the least valuable, and they were also kind of easier to catch then. But the winter when it was thick and they were harder to catch, that's when the fur was the most valuable, so it kind of shaped when they were hunted more and when more pelts were exported.
The characteristics of the beaver are also determining the annual cycle of when these things are being hunted. You don't want the beaver fur in the summer when it's easiest to get. What are the implications of that for how the fur trade works?
People often like looking for the beaver, so moving north, moving up, as needed for the hunt.
So a bunch of things going on. One of them is you have to go to places in rough conditions in like a hard part of the year when these colonial settlers needed help. Gee, we're gonna go into the wilds of Canada in the middle of winter. They didn't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that. And I've got modern gear. How did they do it? How did they pull that off, Victoria?
Indigenous people, yeah, they asked them for guidance kind of thing.
So the characteristics of the resource meant that it determined the nature of the colonial settlers' relationship with the indigenous people as they moved further away. Why did they need to move further away?
Because they were chasing out all the birds, they had to go further on.
Wipe out the beavers in one area, you gotta go further. And how did they travel further? Weren't any roads. Rivers. So they're going on rivers with indigenous partners, collaborators. Where they had to go depended on the sort of winter, the cycle of the beavers and their pelts, but also their natural habitat. This wasn't something that as a settler you just figure out, I'm gonna go get some beavers. I don't wanna go to the cold places. I'm gonna get my beavers in the southern part of this territory. If you looked at those maps on RAID, the nature of the resource, the beaver, had its own habitat, and that determined where they had to go, how they had to get there, and who they had to build partnerships with to pull that off as complete newcomers, unprepared for travel and survival in a very harsh climate. So what Innes did is he showed how the particular characteristics of the resource had these kind of follow-through implications for how that fur trade emerged, what it looked like, what the partnerships were, the timing of it, the location of it. Yeah.
He also describes, like, he says, so in the words of The Economist, that the beaver has like a fixed capital, and that becomes a sort of liability to hunters because they're not able to kind of gain more and more from it every single year. And then he also describes like the life cycle of beavers and how it takes like 2 years for them to become mature, for them to be able to get the fur and things like that. So I think it's kind of just like it is being hunted constantly, but then there's difficulties for the economy because it's not like this sort of source that's readily available that you can just extract from whenever you need to. It takes time, and there's also that issue of like the regrowth and the reproductivity as well.
So great, thank you. That just leads into the next thing I wanted us to talk about, which is the beaver as fixed capital. Is that the term that he used? He loves the little beaver, but he loves it also, you know, he's studying it for its economic value. Is a natural resource necessary, like, they were depleting these resources as they went. They traveled further away because of the beaver was a fixed capital, and once you harvested it, it was gone. Is that inevitable?
Yes.
How so?
Because the originating impulse of the beaver pelt economy doesn't really, I mean, even today where we've got, you know, satellites and digital photos and everything that can show us what an ecosystem looks like, we still don't care and aren't able to factor it into our cost benefit analysis, when literally all it is a pile of furs that are arriving on a ship from the other side of the world. It's impossible for there to be any consideration of how many of these there are, especially when the money is essentially infinite. The richest person will, you know, always want one, and there's all this industrial development going on in Europe. The demand will always be there, and that on the other side of the ocean, but on the other side of the transaction, the result is that there's ever more desire to go further and get more.
Is it possible in theory? So you're like, the reality was, you know, the home state was like, send us all the furs you can get. You know, we want lots of hats. Sean?
Yeah, it would have had to be possible, because beavers and other natural resources in Canada sustain Indigenous people for millennia, practice sustainable harvesting. And so, yeah, of course, post-contact and the capitalist drive to mine it till it's gone, sure, yes, did drive out the beaver and the bison, the abalone here in BC, but based on his history and oral history, we know that these things weren't depleted until different ideas came into play.
So not any natural resource. There are renewable natural resources and non-renewable natural resources. Minerals in the ground, when you dig them up, it's not there and they don't have babies. Beavers do replenish the supply. Trees grow, crops can be harvested, and the issue was that this was in theory a renewable natural resource, but it was being exploited at a non-renewable rate. Part of the challenge is that beavers, it takes a long time for them to replenish the supply. So what made this trade attractive for France and England was this abundant supply, but in fact it wasn't infinite, and many of these resources were significantly depleted, if not decimated, as part of this natural resources trade. You know, with demand, as Adam was saying, coming from people who are not concerned about the sustainability of a renewable resource, which is part sort of we hear about, you know, boom and bust in some of these readings. How does that play out with these early natural resource exports? anything on that?
Well, I think with the pelts, like, weren't they depleted basically to the point where they had to put in laws kind of like similar to what we see with like overfishing kind of thing, like restrict how much is being harvested, sort of thing? So then over time, like, there's not enough supply to eat.
I think eventually that is probably the case, but I'm not sure if that's what happened first.
I did pick up something from the Belshaw reading. I think it was more related to wheat. The idea that how these, like the wheat boom, sort of led to the creation of a monoculture economy in the West, which then meant that because like settlers in Canada saw that, okay, because we can capitalize on this boom, so we will exclude development in these other areas, other manufacturing, these other resources, and only focus on this, leading to, and again, sort of facilitating the creation of an economy that fully dependent on this one resource, and the exporting of this one resource.
So if your economy is dependent on the export of one or a very small number of natural resources, you are hostage to trends in global prices. I don't know what causes crashes in the price of wheat, but they happen. In the case of furs, I believe before, governments got to the point of let's conserve this resource and establish, hunting rights and that sort of thing. Beaver felt hats made from beaver fur just went out of style. Fashion changed and demand declined. And there was this whole economic system set up to harvest those animals.
I think there was also issues with beaver fur because when they made the hats, they had to use a specific chemical that was actually quite harmful to people, and if you're putting it on your head for like a long period of time, it kind of like really damages your scalp as well.
Okay, I did some research, a little bit of research on felt hats. Because when I first started reading about, the beaver pelts were used for hats, I thought they had like furry hats. Daniel Boone sort of thing, or, like you see them. It was not, they were not wearing furry hats. They were using the hair from the beaver pelts, and the value of, I'll just talk louder. In fact, this reminds me, I have hearing aids, and I have learned that I can turn off my phone, but even if it's turned off, it still rings into my ears unless I undo the Bluetooth. So now that will not happen. Once in the middle of a meeting, I got the, the alert, like the missing kid alert that's really loud, went straight into my ears. I pulled these things out and I threw them on the table. I was quite shook up. Okay, so the value of beaver pelts is that beavers have really dense fur. So there are a lot of fibers per, square centimeter, way more than other animals. That's why, and it's because these are animals that have evolved to live underwater in the middle of winter. So that coat is really thick because it protects them from the conditions that they live in, but makes them really good for making felt. And so the process, I've never done felt. Anybody here a knitter who is felting is a thing these days in crafting, but they would have to take the fur off and then turn it into felt, and then they would make hats. Before the 1600s, how they got the hair off the pelts was using urine. Go figure. And what they discovered is that factory workers' urine, the factory workers who were taking mercury as a treatment for syphilis, their urine worked better to get the hair off the pelts. So then they directly started using mercury. And I don't know what the substance of mercury was. Presumably it's in some kind of liquid solution to remove the hair. They stopped using P, and mercury is an extremely toxic substance. And it is a neurotoxic. It affects people's brains. So anybody remember in Alice in Wonderland there was the Mad Hatter?
Mm-hmm.
The Mad Hatter is referring to the madness that is caused by mercury poisoning. I think less from the people wearing the hats and more than people, the real issue is the people who are manufacturing the hats. So we've got kind of this class system between Britain and the colony feeding these raw materials into an emerging industrial class system within the UK as well. The people who were suffering on that side of the ocean were the factory workers who are actually making felt hats for very wealthy people by being exposed to extremely toxic substance. And I don't know to what extent it was concerned like for the workers that caused a decline in demand, or if it was just that the rich people moved on. Or maybe the rich people saw, oh, look at those workers, maybe I'll get sick too. I don't know. I did not, my little research did not, it did not go that far. But that is where Mad as a Hatter comes from. And it was the workers who were processing those beaver pelts to make these top hats that the Mad Hatter wore in all the cartoons. Okie doke. We talked a lot about beaver pelts, and there were other furs as well. An issue still today that many of those have fashion for wearing fur coats has changed, and that has implications for northern fur trade, which still exists on a much smaller scale, but even smaller than it was 40 years ago, for sure. How are wheat? Let's compare furs and wheat. And recall, like, one of the insights of the staples theory is that the nature of the staple, the natural resource, the characteristics of the staple had implications for the economy and settlement that developed. So let's consider the differences between the furs and wheat. Katerina, what do you think?
I think it's just like very different, but also a bit similar in the way that we kind of look at the demand side of these products. Like wheat was seen as a very it said high, I think it's like high bulk or something. High bulk, low value. And also like the seasonal nature of wheat, only being able to plant it in the fall and cultivate it during that period of time, had different economic implications. Whereas like with beavers, like although there was the ideal point in wintertime where their pelts would be their fur would be denser and then more valuable, wheat wasn't as you can't really harvest it and cultivate it year round. It's like a limited time frame that you can really use it. And so I think it was different in that sort of way.
So similar different in which season, although the beavers had a preferred season too, just because of the density of the fur. In both cases, we've got products that have their own seasonality, their own conditions that they grow in, presumably. In both cases, high volume, low value, which means you need that high capital investment. You need big ships to get this stuff off. You need costly upfront investments. So some really good similarities. Mahan, and then I'm going to come to Tim and Sean.
I think with wheat emerging as a staple commodity for Canada, it changed sort of how the settler patterns work, especially because wheat was more land intensive than the fur trade was, and obviously it is something that they could sort of control the expansion of. And with more land, and there was more wheat, you could export more, you could gain more out of it. And so then you start seeing patterns of like the settlers needing more land, going more inland, not having to depend on like just being in like certain areas where you get the fur. But like with wheat, you could find the land, find places you could expand it, grow it more. And I guess then sort of like going back to the point, like led to that creation of a monoculture, which then meant the wheat was more, I think, more so compared to the fur trade, was more sort of vulnerable to changes in the global markets, the booms and the busts. So yeah.
Okay, so the wheat isn't moving. You could do it in, it needs more space. Sean's got a 2-finger. This is our first 2-finger,
Yeah.
excellent. Remember, that's like if you really wanna get in there right away, show me 2 fingers.
I was gonna say something quite similar. Yeah, wheat, unlike beavers, wheat doesn't run away. You don't need to chase
Oh, I think the
it.
beavers are pretty slow moving and we.
Yes, yes. But instead you need land, and thus you need to clear land. And so I would say kind of a difference there is instead of employing indigenous people to help you get around, with the wheat industry growth, you actually need to remove and displace indigenous people, especially in like southern Ontario and the prairie provinces, to get arable land. And so it's this shift from working together to, okay, now you guys gotta get out of here so I can get the land and then bring in Ukrainian settlers like people.
Yeah, Ben,
I was gonna say that like links perfectly
I
to
love
the
2-finger comments.
Gunton quote where he said, if First Nations are integral to the extraction of a staple, such as in the fur trade, they receive benefit from the staple economy, but if they're obstacles to development, they're more likely to be excluded and harmed.
So the difference in how this resource is harvested, the beavers didn't actually move away, but you could always go find more. You could move to the beavers. The wheat, you grow it right there, you're gonna harvest it in the same place, and it takes up a lot of space. And so instead of, the differences between the resources had huge implications for the relationship between the colonial settlers and the indigenous peoples. Potentially mutually beneficial relationships in the case of the fur trade, displacing people from their own land in the case of expansion for large-scale agriculture. And the way that, I'm gonna come back in a sec, I've got Tim and then next, and then, the way that happened, has anybody done any reading on kind of how that settlement, this would have been, I'm trying to remember the timing of this, if Canada existed or if it would have been the colony. But they would advertise to, Europeans, come to Canada, we'll give you X plot of land, and in exchange, all you have to do is put like a settlement on it. So so the settlement, European settlement of the prairies, the squareness, they sent surveyors out there. That was kind of the first, probably the Mounties and then the surveyors. They plotted out areas of land and they gave the land away in exchange for settlers who then removed the trees and built this wheat economy. Tim.
Yes. Kind of on that thing that you were just talking about, though, with the settlements, a fun fact I wanted to share was that apparently the English ones or the British ones were square plots of lands, and the French ones were rectangular. So just thought.
Well, the French because the French ones, so in New France along the St. Lawrence River, they're shaped long and thin, and on the prairies they were square. Why? Why do you think that would be? That is a fun fact.
I would assume like the way the water is and like how, like if it's just like a singular river, then there's only so much water, so you want to have long, so more people can have land, I guess.
It was to, so that people could have waterfront. That was their road. And so there were these long, thin plots along the St. Lawrence. Whereas, you know, on the prairies, you're gonna be building you're gonna need roads and a railroad anyway. So might as well have regular shape, I guess. How about,
I-
oh
I
yeah,
have-
please, oh
I
you
have
have
an
more?
actual main
Okay,
point.
good. Well, I thought the fun fact was
No,
pretty great already.
sorry. Yeah, but kind of similar on the kind of like wheat needs more land. So like by nature, wheat farming kind of encourages like more ruralness. That's where like it's more spread out, right? Versus convergent, like people settle around the farms, right? And so that, you know, kind of rural versus not exactly urban, but less rural, kind of shape out the economies in those regions.
Yeah, interesting. I think with the fur trade, they settle somewhere else, because the traders go off and they do their, you know, I don't know how long each one of these trips, many months, trips out into, they've got their provisions, they trade them for pelts, and then they come back with, you know, boats full of animal pelts to the town. Whereas the settlers, not only is the wheat staying put, the people who are growing that wheat on that land are staying put and, you know, kind of distance out. I don't know.
A couple of things. First, I was gonna say that I think like the thing with wheat is that it's had a lot to walk, and like the idea of you need to
Lots of
Locke, like John Locke,
Yeah.
saying
Oh,
that you
oh.
need to work
Capital L
Yeah.
with an E.
that you have to work the property for it to be considered yours, that sort of idea. And I think like with like hunting, for example, most indigenous nations were hunting animals for, you know, for different purposes, but in the majority of the nations didn't have like large scale farming in the way that the wheat farming came in. And I think the idea of you need to just build yourself a settlement and then work land is kind of like this is our claim to the land, because we're working it, it's going to be considered ours. So I think that's kind of like the issue with the wheat farming, and that also encourages way less interaction between the settlers and the indigenous communities, whereas the beaver hunting was a little bit more of a relationship there. And then the other problem with the wheat as well is that obviously wherever the land is more fertile, people want to live there and work there, but fertile land is more attractive for anybody, so that's kind of pushing away the indigenous communities into less desirable lands.
We'll take the nice land, thanks.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of a lot of times it was like relocating nations to different parts of like just like really bad areas that, you know, you didn't have water access or things like that. That's kind of an issue. I have another comment.
Keep going. This is great.
Also the like the Nancy Oweiler reading that you sent to me, she kind
Let's
of,
come back to that
okay,
one.
yeah.
I'm gonna come back to that because it gets into more complicated stuff. You said something about less interaction with indigenous peoples, less ongoing interaction. There's like a big one-time interaction, which is, you know, we're here, and, you know, maybe a treaty, maybe not, and, you know, off you go. Potentially, in the US, much more violence than I think was the case in Canada, where, for whatever reason. I'm guessing some of this history and Locke is Barbara, you're referencing Barbara O'Neill's work, so my colleague in the political science department, Barbara O'Neill, has, you know, a super important book on Locke's theory of colonial development with implications for indigenous peoples. Sean?
Returning kind of to the question of advertising and settlement, especially the prairies, if I remember correctly, it would have been post-Confederation, end of the 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah, it had to be because there wasn't any
Just
way to
before
get
the-
them there.
Before the war.
Mhm.
There was a lot of advertising, especially in Eastern Europe. I mentioned Ukraine specifically, the new Best West, the next El Dorado, but Ukraine specifically because it's Europe's breadbasket, and so you're intentionally
And it's
advertising. And it's cold, and harsh, so you're intentionally advertising to a specific people to then come and clear the land and grow the wheat. And I think that also adds to the question of wheat prices. Thinking about like the USSR and Europe and war. So just some wheat info.
Thank you. Why monoculture? Because that's a point that you've made. It's a point that's made in, I can't, you know, probably probably Belshaw, the Belshaw reading. Well, you know, large scale farming, yes. Why the same crop?
Was it to dominate like the global, what's it called, trade?
It's, I mean, I think it's related to this issue. I think it was Cameron about it, maybe the kind of high volume, low value. If you've got a high volume, low value product, you want to produce a lot of it. If you're going to set up systems to ship this stuff out, it's not worth your while. If you know, in dribs and drabs. So it meant setting up an economy to ship out that wheat, including the railroad, the grain elevators, specialized ships. If you're going to, you know, ship bulk wheat, you can't, you know, you store it in a particular, you know, like you don't put oil in the same ship as you ship wheat in. That's a kind of modern issue, but they are ships that are special purpose. So there was a need for, it made sense if you had large scale, but that meant that the farmers, this wasn't subsistence farming. It not only wasn't the kind of small scale agriculture that First Nations might have engaged in, it wasn't the kind of, it wasn't like my grandpa's farm where he had, you know, a bunch of corn over there and a bunch of, you know, turnips over there. These are big single crop farms, and that enhance the vulnerability to those price swings also because you put all your money in building a wheat economy with grain elevators and railroads. Those are really expensive things in their day, and they were, you know, single purpose. The railroad less so. The railroads are kind of useful for other stuff too, but once you move people to the prairies to grow wheat, that's what it's being used for. I don't know.
Oh, I was just gonna say that even then it's not mercantilist, and when we talk about the railways were heavily subsidized, it wouldn't have been built by simply private initiative alone, that the land was cleared and given for not free, but very much at a discount, and you know, very advantageous, that the railways probably wouldn't be built in that if all other things being equal today, we wouldn't build a railway because you can't really appropriate that much land in the same way. Can't really have that much cheap and very unsafe labor, all these things where not mercantilist, it's not on an international scale, but still it was very state driven.
Although we are building railroads, just, you know, in theory, there's gonna be high-speed rail, we'll see, between, I don't know if it's Windsor to Quebec City.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's a very expensive proposition. It was a very expensive proposition back then too, but made more affordable by using cheap labor, by taking the land without payment, among other, yeah.
Just to the question of like why wheat and not other crops. I think there had to be sort of an environmental aspect to it, like just the area that they chose to grow the wheat. Because I just did a quick look up when I was doing the readings, and I think just the idea of like where the prairies were and the conditions that were there, like it was just perfect for wheat to not just get high yield but also get like high quality wheat, which sort of then led to, I feel like there has to be some sort of a feedback effect of like you found the perfect environment to grow it. You grow it and you realize that this is pretty profitable, and then you realize that there's more demand for it, and with that demand they started to just expand it more until they got to the point where it's like now we just have so much of it and we're doing so much of it that it sort of deterred development for other sort of resources, not just in crop resources but just in general. And I think there had to be some sort of a loop effect there.
No, so you can finish your.
No,
It wasn't
please.
a two-
I would rather hear from you than myself.
I was just gonna say, I think you said something about the environment. One thing is, things like wheat and just like farming in general, compared to an animal, let's say, I feel like are much more susceptible to short-term environmental impacts. For example, if a drought happens, then all those farmers most likely are not making any money that year. And there was lots of multi-year droughts throughout like the 1900s in the prairies as well. Whereas,
And the
yeah.
1920s,
Yes, yeah.
the prairie wheat, the Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
Dust Bowl.
And then it like compared to a beaver where there might be like a bit like like long-term slow dwindling, it wasn't like 1 year there's no beavers whatsoever. It was more just like there may be less beavers, but then with wheat it can just honestly be like there is no wheat this year, and I think that's a really like harsh impact to the economy. And
Is wheat especially susceptible, or is that just a vulnerability of having an agricultural economy?
I think it's just
Yeah, maybe wheat needs water more than other things, I don't know,
I
but I
think-
suspect not, because otherwise we wouldn't be growing it on the prairies in large quantities. So there's also an issue of was this the perfect environment for wheat, or was wheat the thing that we could grow in this environment? And I suspect it was a bit the latter, but then we became specialists in it. We are the wheat producers. Ukraine, Canada, that's kind of we're the big wheat growers in the world. How about resource depletion? We were talking about how the beavers, if they're not harvested at a sustainable rate, we're wiping out beavers, or at least significantly depleting the numbers. You know, we plant it every year.
it's incredibly harmful to the soil, so it causes long-term soil degradation, especially because maybe not nowadays, but especially back in the day, they used very, very harsh chemicals on the soil as well, which causes the soil to kind of just become dead over time, and it causes like a lower and lower yield over time as well. And especially because it's a monoculture, which is really bad for the soil because there's not enough biodiversity, and because it's just being like constantly farmed using European chemicals like systems.
So there are ways to farm more sustainably, but it usually involves leaving land fallow, not growing on it for a certain period of time, and sort of rotating what crops. It involves different crops. Some crops sort of complement what other crops do to the soil. It involves leaving the land unused for periods of time, and it involves not putting a bunch of chemical fertilizers on it. So there is harm to the land. The trees were wiped out. There were forests on that land. So in the wheat may not be the comparator to the beaver. The trees were. These large swaths of land that we think of as kind of naturally having no trees on them. A lot of them had trees on them, and it's just gone. It's not even in our imagination anymore. Yeah.
I was also gonna say like river pollution as well. So a lot of the runoff with chemical fertilizers and things like that would cause issues with the river. And then also if you're just like removing forests completely, that also causes issues with the natural landscape and the tributaries and stuff like that as well.
And fertilizers, depending on the depth of the groundwater, can also leach down the soil and contaminate groundwater. And I think this hasn't been an issue in Canada for a long time, but there was a phenomenon of nitrate fertilizers contaminating waterways, and then blue babies, babies not being able to get enough oxygen, like the water was actually unhealthy, but the babies would be the first sign that you had a problem. I don't think that happens so much anymore. The Manuel and Derrickson reading, Derrickson, Manuel, I can't remember what order they are. Arthur Manuel, a revered figure in the Indigenous community, especially in British Columbia. What does that chapter, what did you take away from that chapter? Yeah.
It kind of blows a little puff of air at this whole story that we have, and then it makes us realize that, it's just this little piece of paper standing up, it falls over and you see what's behind it. As far as the Indigenous perspective, or an Indigenous perspective on the development of Canada, the settler polity of Canada, and of resource extraction, I think that it is encapsulated in one passes so well. It says that the partnership model that existed in the fur trade was only a function of the business environment, and that much more cruel and rapacious kind of dynamic was only a matter of time and only a matter of the mode of production that was taking place. And as soon as fixed field agriculture became that mode, then everything that we're familiar with Canada dispossessing Indigenous peoples just started to run rampant. It's a nice and short chapter that's very hard to think.
It is short but hard hitting. It is not. It's a different tone. This is not. It's a different type of writing, and appropriately so. And this isn't like, oh, what about the Indigenous people? These are Indigenous people writing about their own lives and their own communities.
Again, like I said, like definitely a very impactful reading. Took me back to a lot of the readings I did back in school when we talked about like colonialism, especially in
Like high school or something, or
and sort of like in my lab part of high school when we talked about like sort of the history of colonialism in the Indian subcontinent, and just the idea of like how colonialism depends on that sort of slow violence. And I think the word that they use in the sort of term they used in the reading was the incremental theft, and it's just how colonialism sort of depends on that, and then and how that's how it happened in Canada. And like again, this is a pattern you see in all the colonies and like throughout history. Like this is the same thing in India, same thing in Bangladesh, same thing in most countries in the subcontinent. Like how the British going over there and then like completely pillaging everything, all the resources, turning the entire subcontinent into like sort of the producer of raw materials for cotton, especially with taking sort of a more Bangladesh context. The one thing that the one thing that I was always talking about was like our muslin, and how the British
muslin with an N.
With an N, yes. And how the muslin cloth was like fully, it was pillaged to the point that the trade was completely destroyed, and we cannot produce the cloth in the same quality that it used to be produced back then. And there's a lot of like government efforts to try to get that back.
Is that because of like damage to the land?
Damage to the crop,
and
I think what they recently found out was because it was created from a very specific kind of plant that doesn't exist anymore.
It just got like over.
It was just overproduced. It was made
They
to such a
didn't keep
point.
enough for seeds.
It wasn't sustainable enough, and so now it just doesn't exist anymore.
Wow.
And there are efforts to try to recover it, but like even then, like the group of scientists who are working on it are like they don't think they can ever get it back to like 100% the quality that it was, but they are trying their best to get it to as close as possible. But like in its peak, the quality was like you could have like a square meter of cloth that you could fold it into a matchbox. And there's like one piece of it that you can still see in one of our museums there, but like that was sort of the idea that like that's how fine the cloth was. So like as I was reading this, like I was just sort of like drawing those
makes me want
parallels.
to cry. Oh my God.
But yeah, it's just like that's the parallels that I was drawing, that like how sometimes in a lot of the things that we read about like how the history of Canada, like the thing, like, and I think this is something that I'm constantly drawing these parallels in all of my classes, is like how these patterns of colonialism, like they repeat across the histories of every country that was colonized. And yeah, I think that's, for me, that was the parallel that I was drawing, just seeing those patterns.
I feel emotional. Anybody else like read Jane Austen? Yeah. Like, okay, I'm guessing like women are nodding and not so much. Really, it's great. But you know, the women they're wearing their fine muslins, and I had this image of kind of what muslin fabric was, but I had never actually thought about that. What I had thought about is, I don't know where in South Asia hemp was grown, and would that have been Bangladesh or India?
I think it's more of the northeastern part of India. The part that I went in Darjeeling, they did a lot of like hemp culture, and like I actually have a bag at home that's made from hemp. But yeah, it's very common there. I don't know if that was the only place. There had to have been like other areas in that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it was exported as a raw material to the UK, and then it was processed to make jute. So a very rough fabric that was used like to pack stuff before we had, plastic bags and stuff, jute. And so Dundee, where my husband's family is from, was where all the jute mills were. And so there was this trade of raw hemp. It was made into jute, and that was kind of Dundee as a satellite economy within the UK in kind of, not north of Scotland, but north of the metropolis in London. And then technological changes in demand. I'm pointing at you, Victoria, because I don't know why. The jute mills are all closed, and Dundee went into economic decline, and I assume it was much worse in the places that were growing the hemp in the first place.
Just as I said, I remember Bangladesh is a major exporter of jute, and it still is.
Still is, okay.
And
Actually in the finished fabric?
Yes, yeah, but like,
Okay.
and like I forgot what we call it, like we call it the gold crop in Bangla, and yeah, like, but like even then, like, but Dhaka and like its surrounding areas were like, these were like the major crops, like cotton, jute, and like muslin at the beginning, because it was a very specialized trade, but then obviously that died out, like, so I think the early 1800s is when it like fully died out as like a very specialized craft. But jute was like a big thing for Bangladesh as well.
Yeah.
I think that kind of ties back to the idea that resources that were kind of seen as traditional or daily sources for indigenous communities, whether that's a specific type of herb or a specific type of animal for Canadian indigenous nations, or whether it's like a fine muslin cloth in Bangladesh, I think it becomes this like trend or this fad across, but it's actually like an internal part of the culture of a nation that already exists for a really long time. Like the muslin, for example, Marie Antoinette would wear that, and it became this like whole like, oh my god, like look at this super thin fabric, it's such a trendy thing. And then with beaver hats, yeah, and like with beaver hats, it's like everybody was wearing these, men were wearing them, it became this huge thing. And I think it's like, to that economy, it's kind of just like this trend, and it eventually dies out.
It was their fast fashion.
Yeah, it was their fast fashion, but for the actual communities which are using them and have been using them for a long time, it's a part of the culture, which I think is like this like really interesting sort of parallel.
Absolutely. Katarina?
Yeah, I think back to like the original question, I think the relationships with the indigenous, I think were only for like the partnerships were only useful so long as it benefited like the colonial like position or person in power. And I think it kind of speaks to like contemporary globalization, and how a lot of these global superpowers take advantage of smaller states for like fewer restrictions in terms of like fast fashion or cheap labor. And then when these states increase regulations, or if there happens to be something that causes a shift, these global superpowers just go to another state that can provide the same thing. And then these smaller states are left with the negative implications of like climate change or issues in labor and things like that.
And we're in one of those smaller states. We're in a wealthy smaller state, but we're about to find out how a big state feels about us next week. One of the possibly a difference when we turn to oil, we'll turn to oil after the break, is there are a lot of places that you can grow certain crops, and that makes it easier to just move on. We took what we got from you, and your land is, crappy now, we're gonna move on to someplace else. Oil is only in certain places, and not, so that it is it is distinctive where it is found. So that is a slight difference in the case of Canada's relationship with the US, but we are small and they are big, and we have, that's who we send our exports to. Like 99% of our oil and gas exports go to the US, almost none go anywhere else. I guess now that the Trans Mountain Pipeline is operating, there will be some. So that 99% will be pre-Trans Mountain. Back to Manuel and Derrickson, I found the quote when Mahin was talking. Am I saying your name right?
It's Mahan.
It's incremental, but it's also permanent. And that's, I think, the really powerful for me argument. That this is not, the remedy is not apologies and hugs, but recognition and restitution. This is not a marriage where we're arguing this is something that has been stolen. And that theft was part of the land on a large scale being developed for export of natural resources. Did anyone catch any of the discussion in the Arthur Ray reading? That Arthur Ray is like an introduction to a 1998 edition of, I think, the fur trade in Canada. Did anyone catch what he had to say about what economic and ethno-historians have said when they revisited Innes's work in many decades later?
Is it that most ethno-historians are thinking that Indigenous people were like a dying community? He mentioned something that at that time people thought that like Indigenous communities were.
Okay, so the original, like at the time, Innes and his colleagues were sort of seeing Indigenous communities as, on their way out.
Yeah.
And with, writing in the 1990s, it was clear that that had not happened. So part of it. Anything else? I think it sounds like there's some complicated debates among historians, or there were in the 1990s. So it's not really simple. That's actually one of the things I take away from this. There was a style of scholarship, 100 years ago, which is very deterministic. It's like, I have figured out how this worked, and therefore I have this theory and it works. And nowadays we have much more recognition of complexity. There is no expectation that anyone's going to come up with the grand theory that's going to explain it all to us. So the fact that historians are disagreeing about the relationship between fur traders and Indigenous peoples is probably because it was more complicated, and different Indigenous communities had different positions. One of the things that came through to me, that this wasn't just, oh good, we're getting teapots and guns and beads. It was that Indigenous nations were participating in the trade strategically for security reasons about, land. In the same way the British or French were doing that, so were their Indigenous partners. Like, they were entering into certain agreements so that they could control land as well, rather than just as a transactional, oh good, give us some beads. Let's take a break till 20.